no Amerikas Savienotām valstīm, tieši lai apmeklētu mūsu konferenci. Viņš ir ekonomikas un politikas pētījumu centra direktors, dibinātājs, centrs atrodas Vašingtonā. Tā ir viena no pasaulē visslavenākām domnīcām, kuru citē politiķi, valdības, žurnālisti, un es domāju, ka tagad Marks Weisbrots mums sniegs savu ziņojumu, kurā mēs palūdzam viņam pateikt savu teoretisko ieskatu un skatienu par to, kas notiek pasaulē un pasaules mērogā Latvijā, un tajā griezumā, par kuru mēs uzsakam tagad runāt. Par to, vai ir jēga ietaupīt vai aizņemties valstī, kas ir attīstības valsts, un kura ir krīzes apstākļos. Lūdzu, Marks. Tulkojums? Take the floor, please, Mark. Here you are.
Okay, thank you. Just want to see. Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction, Igor, and I want to thank Sergey and everyone else who organized this, and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung also. And it's a pleasure to be here with this distinguished panel as well. And I want to start a little bit. And by the way, you can find anything that the things that I'm talking about. Although actually, I will write a paper based on this, but everything ends up on the web at cepr.net. And we're just a little bit about us. We're a nonprofit think tank in the United States. We're funded by foundations. We don't get money from governments or corporations or even unions. And so we were able to present an independent perspective. And I think that I want to start with the Eurozone, which is quite a bit in the news as we speak, because as you can see, the agreement of just a week or two ago has once again failed to stem the crisis, and it has everything to do with the topic that we're talking about today. Because what the peripheral Eurozone economies, Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and now Italy, are trying to accomplish is the same strategy that was pursued here in Latvia, which is called an internal devaluation. That is, they cannot devalue their currency, and so what they are trying to do, and they don't have control, because they don't have control over their currency, they don't have control over their monetary policy, and now they don't have control over their fiscal policy either, because that is being determined by the European authorities. The IMF is a secondary partner, mainly the European Central Bank and the European Union. And so this has really failed terribly, and I have to emphasize this because your Prime Minister and U.S. economists have co-authored a book, which I had the opportunity to read on the way here, arguing that Latvia should be used as an example for all these other countries, including Greece and everybody, that this strategy can really work. The strategy that they're pursuing in Europe can really work. And I think that's wrong, and I think it's wrong not only because of what's happening in Europe, but also what happened in Latvia. So I'm going to address both of those questions. And it has a lot to do with this question of what fiscal policy, that is budget and tax policy, and other macroeconomic policy should look like when an economy goes into a recession or stops growing. Okay? So, the first thing I want to emphasize about Europe is that the Eurozone is that this is not, as is often suggested in media, a crisis of overborrowing or debt. Possibly with the exception of Greece, but the other countries didn't really overborrow at all. They were hit by a financial crisis that shrunk their economies, and as a result, they suffer from a debt problem. But even Greece, if you look at Greece, their debt was 115% of GDP in May of 2010, when they began negotiating their first agreement with the IMF and with the Troika, the European authorities. And now it's 166%, okay? And the economy is shrinking at 5.5% annual rate now. So you see, they could have resolved even their debt problem with very little money at that time from the European Union and the European authorities. And instead, they made the crisis worse and worse and worse until now, even the 50% debt write-off that has been tentatively agreed upon will not be enough to resolve Greece's problem. That is, even with a 50% haircut that they're proposing, Greece will only decline its debt or reduce its debt from the current 166% of GDP to 120% 9 years from now. Okay? That is what the authorities are saying. And this is not enough given the interest rates that they're going to pay. They are still in a default situation, even if this agreement goes through. So you see, this is what I mean by a policy failure. The crisis we're looking at right now in Europe is a result of repeated policy failure. Why do we have an acute crisis right now in the Eurozone? It's because the financial markets are afraid that the European authorities will do to Italy exactly what they've done to Greece. And they've already started to do it. What do I mean by what they've done to Greece? What they do is they say to Italy, you have to cut your fiscal deficit even though your economy is slowing. And you have to meet a certain deficit target. And what happens is they cut that deficit, and then the economy shrinks, and then they have less revenue, so they have to cut even more to make the target, and the economy shrinks further. That's what's been happening to Greece for 2 years now. That's why Greece is a mess. Now, if this happens to Italy, which is already beginning to happen, as you'll see, they already have, the IMF has already lowered their projections for Italy's growth in the last 6 months just because of the austerity policies that they have agreed to. Then Greece, if Italy goes into this same downward spiral, they have $2.6 trillion of debt, and that is 5 times Greece, and that is something that the European Union will have trouble bailing out, okay? And that is why you see this panic in the financial markets. And I say it's panic because Italian bonds, 10-year bond rates are over 6% now. That's the same as it was. It's higher than it was in July when this crisis started. So you see, even though the European authorities keep moving further, closer to getting a solution, they're not anywhere near a solution as far as the financial markets are concerned. And so therefore, you still have this crisis. And that is the one thing I want to emphasize, this idea of fiscal consolidation, which, as Igor has mentioned, is being proposed to be written into the Constitution here, can be extremely dangerous. I mean, this is slowing the entire world economy. Even Brazil now is going to have zero growth in the 3rd quarter because of what is happening, or at least partly because of what is happening in Europe, okay? So, that's what I want to emphasize. And I don't want to go into too much of detail because I want to spend at least most of the time here on the Latvian economy. So, just to show you what policy failure looks like, here you can see Italy. This is just real GDP, and it's projected after 2011, okay, or including 2011. And you can see that the dashed blue line was the projections of the IMF in the spring, and the solid blue line at the bottom is the projections they had most recently in September. You can see they've already had to lower their growth projections. This is what is exacerbating the crisis in Europe. And Ireland, of course. And by the way, for all these graphs, what we have at the top is the trend growth of the country. So you can see that these countries don't ever project, they're not even, 10 years after the crisis, they're nowhere near their trend growth, okay? So even if things go well and they recover as quickly as the IMF is projecting, there's still an enormous amount of lost output from these years and years of stagnation. And the same is true, of course, for Ireland. Now, their trend growth is kind of high, but you can see you could even bring it down by half, and you never get close to it. Greece, of course, is the worst case here. And, I want to emphasize before we get to Latvia, look at Greece here, and you can see their projections keep getting worse and worse because the policies that they are imposing on Greece keep forcing it worse. But look at Greece in 2012, it hits the lowest point. That is, it's 13% down from its pre-crisis GDP, okay? That's the worst of the European Union. That's got people rioting in the streets. Do you know how much Latvia lost in only 2 years? 25%. Twice as bad as Greece. So if you are proposing, if the Prime Minister wants to propose that these countries should follow, they will not do it. Nobody, the Greek people will not take that kind of punishment. And very few democracies in the world would be able to do, I think, what Latvia did. That is, take a loss of 25% of national income. So that is why the solution cannot work in the rest of Europe. Although I would argue that it didn't work here either, in the sense that the loss was too great, that there were other policies that could have avoided these kinds of losses. Now, just to look at, I want to make this one comparison, of course. If you look at Argentina, who had one of the worst recessions in the whole 20th century, it began in 1998. It took them 3 years to get back to after they defaulted on their debt and abandoned the austerity policies, they got back to their pre-crisis GDP in 3 years, and you can see they also recovered their trend GDP 6 years later. Okay, so I just want to briefly look at the human cost of this kind of economic policy failure. You can see 14% unemployment in Ireland. Greece, it's actually now 17% since this was done. Italy is not as bad. Spain is the worst. It's actually the latest figures for September, 22.6% unemployment. And of course, the European economy is stalling now. Even Germany and France are barely growing at all. And so it doesn't look good. And that is the consequence, again, of policy failure, of trying to shrink your way out of a recession. Now, I'm not saying it would never work. If these countries were to lose 25% of their income, as Latvia did, well, then maybe they would eventually recover. But that, I think, would be an even worse mistake. And as I said, they wouldn't take it. Okay, I want to go now directly to the Latvian economy, if I can find the other PowerPoint presentation on here. Which one is it? Sorry. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so here, this graph just shows the GDP of Latvia and what happened to the Latvian economy. And most of you know this story. But you can see there was a 22% drop on a yearly basis. It was actually 25% if you look at it quarterly. In 2 years, the worst in the whole world during years 2008 and 2009. And now you see the economy is beginning to recover, not very fast, probably projected growth of 4% this year and 3% for next year. But you can see this is enormous fall in income. And you can see, if you take the top line here, is the trend projected by the IMF in 2008. So it's not a trend based on the bubble growth of the previous years. It's a very weak, slow trend growth. And you can see that Latvia does not get back to the trend level of GDP until 2039, but it will approach its pre-crisis level of GDP after about 9 years in 2016. So again, this is a very, very slow recovery. This is an enormous cost to the economy, and it's, in my opinion, unnecessary. That is, you didn't have to have this kind of decline. You were kind of guaranteed some kind of recession, just like us in the United States, right? We had an $8 trillion housing bubble, and when that burst, there was no way to avoid a recession. But we didn't have to have 4 years of no growth, okay? We're right now in the United States just at the level of GDP that we had 4 years ago. Latvia is going to take 9 years to hit that. We could have done enormously better than that, but we did not have a government that was sufficiently capable to do what was necessary for a robust recovery. Now, I just want to look, here is just the contributions to growth. You can see that the economy on a year-over-year basis has now been growing for 4 quarters. It's been growing more than that, a couple more quarters if you look at a quarterly basis. And the only thing you have to see on this graph, that you did get a contribution, a significant contribution of exports. That's the gray here. If you look at the gray, the last 4th quarter, the gray area, that was the biggest thing that has rebounded the, that has carried the recovery of all the contributions to growth. So you did get something, that's what happens when you do the internal devaluation. You're abandoning, you know, to some extent, the attempt to stimulate the economy, so you're really relying on the rest of the world to pull you out. And that happened a little bit here, but as you'll see, and this is, I want to emphasize this more than anything else I'm saying today, because it's extremely important. You know, I came here in January of 2010, and the outlook was very bad at that time. And we didn't even know if the Latvian economy was going to recover at all. It could have gone further downward. It had already lost 25%, and there was no, it wasn't really clear that it was going to recover at all. And here, I must emphasize, the government at that time had pledged to cut 6.5 percentage points out of its budget deficit, okay? 6.5% of GDP. That's what they said they were going to do. And they also said that they were going to have a relatively tight monetary policy as well. That is to defend the exchange rate. And what I want to show you most importantly is that did not happen. First of all, you can see the inflation that happened. When I was here, inflation was negative 4.2%. That is why the outlook looked so bad, because the deflation was really hurting, it was increasing your debt problem. And what the country really needed was inflation. But the government was pursuing a policy of deflation, okay? Well, what happened is you got lucky. The rest of the world gave you some inflation, okay? And inflation rose from a negative 4.2% to 5%, all right? And why did that help? Well, if you look at the projection for the debt of the economy, well, the IMF was projecting a debt next year, or this year, of 87% of GDP. It's only 43% now. Why is that? It's because you got inflation, okay? That's what reduced your debt problem. And so these projections, the IMF had even worse projections under a worse deflationary scenario. You can see the debt was explosive. So a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, Latvia was looking at a huge problem in debt because the government was pursuing a deflationary strategy, and the IMF was making its projections on that basis. They weren't wrong. If the government had done what they said they were going to do, you would be looking at a terrible deflationary problem. Now, what happened? I'll come back to the other things, but I want to emphasize this one first. Okay, I hope you can see this graph. This is the fiscal balance of Latvia along with other countries, Germany, the Euro area, and the United States. But look at Latvia first. Can you see the gray line? I don't know how visible it is. Yeah, it doesn't look too bad on the screen, okay? It's the third one down. It's the gray line, and the dotted line is projections, which begin for 2011. Now look at before the dotted line. So here's 2009. You had a budget deficit of 7.8% of GDP. Now 2010, the government was pledging to cut that almost by 6.5 percentage points. Look at what actually happened. It's the same. The deficit for 2010 is 7.8% of GDP, the same as 2009. So you see, the government did not do what it said it was going to do at that time. It did not have this enormous fiscal tightening, which would have shrunk the economy and made a bigger mess. Okay? That, in my opinion, is why the economy recovered. And why it looked so bad back then was because the government was pledging to cut much more, vastly more. And that was part of the overall strategy. And if I can go to monetary policy, you can see interest rates. The government has also brought interest rates down from 3% in 2009 to 0.3%, the short-term lending rate today. So that was also an expansionary monetary policy. So you see, the government didn't do the internal devaluation strategy after 2009. You had this huge contraction, but they didn't do what the IMF and everyone expected them to do, and they instead pursued the opposite of what what the Eurozone is doing, and what the European Central Bank and the European fiscal authorities are doing. They did not cut the budget or the fiscal deficit, and they did not cut. They lowered interest rates, and so they were able to recover even while keeping the fixed exchange rate. Now, again, your Prime Minister argues that this is a success story, a success and an internal devaluation. I would argue that no, it was not a success at all, because you didn't have to have a loss of a quarter of your national income. Emigration, as Igor's mentioned, of 10 to 13, I don't know how much percent of the population exactly has left. And the 16% unemployment that you have now, of course, it's better than it was at the peak, and we're going to look at that in a second. But these are huge social costs that were unnecessary, because the government could have pursued an expansionary policy much earlier than it actually did. And so, again, if you want to just ignore the first 2 years, the worst decline in the world, and just take your accounting from a year ago, well, then you can say, yes, it is a success. The economy is recovered. But let me just look at the employment and unemployment situation. There you can see the official unemployment rate. It's down now from 16 to 16% from 20%. That's the dark blue line. But you have another measure which includes involuntarily part-time, and that is considerably higher. That is, if you include workers who are, and we measure this also in the United States, the 21%, you have 21% unemployed if you include the underemployed, the people who are working involuntarily part-time. So you have a long way to go, and you have a long way to go in terms of employment. That's the other way you can measure it. If you look at the bottom blue line here on this graph, you lost 19% of the jobs in this country in terms of employment, and you've recovered about maybe 3-4 percentage points of that now, and still a long way to go before that is recovered. So, again, that is why I would not want any government to tie themselves to some kind of constitutional or other law that limits what they can do in terms of deficit spending when the economy is weak or in recession, because that is what is necessary when the economy is weak or in recession. And the experience of the last few years proves that. Let me go back to this graph here. You can see that even Germany, which is the economy that had the one of the strictest fiscal policies, they had a huge increase in their deficit from basically 0 to 3.3% of GDP. And then they started this year to consolidate, and I think the authorities there will conclude that that was premature. In other words, they should not have tried to tighten their deficit now because their economy is not growing. Now, Germany is fortunate in that they have also pursued a policy which we are trying very hard to get in the United States, which is work sharing. That is, they actually they paid employers to allow people to work at reduced hours, and so they have lowered their unemployment to 5.9% right now. And that's a very good policy and something that other countries should look to. But the macroeconomic policy, I think, was premature. If you look at the euro area, again, they had to have, as a whole, a deficit of 6.4% of GDP, far beyond the 2% that Igor's mentioned, which is the target here. And the United States, of course, went much further. But not far enough, actually, because we had a stimulus that did save, according to the consensus of economists in the United States, all across the political spectrum, we saved maybe between 1.5 and 2.5 million jobs because of the stimulus program that we had. But unfortunately, it was only about 1/8 the size of what we lost from the bursting of the giant real estate bubble that we had in terms of private demand. So you see, stimulus policies are very, very necessary. When private demand collapses, that is what is necessary to maintain employment and to keep the economy on a path of growth and development. And I want to say we're having this debate right now in the United States because we have 9% unemployment, and if you count the underemployed, it's 16%. It's the worst that it's been since the Great Depression. And it's the president, is worried about his re-election. In fact, he sent his Treasury Secretary to crash the summit of the Eurozone in order to tell them that they should get their act together and stop this pro-cyclical, counterproductive fiscal policy, because it was going to cost President Obama his re-election. And of course, they didn't listen to Tim Geithner, and they weren't very happy about him being there and telling them that. But the point is that this crisis in Europe is affecting the whole world, and it really is because of this failure. And that is why I think it would be a mistake for any government to write into law the kind of policy failure that we're witnessing in Europe today that is threatening the entire world economy. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.